Before you count sheep, count mysteries.
In the autumn of 1888, London was the largest city in the world. More than 5 million people live within its crowded streets, making it the heart of the British Empire. To the outside world, it was a city of wealth, innovation, and opportunity. Grand buildings lined the streets of Westminster. Elegant gentlemen attended theaters and private clubs. The royal family represented stability and power. But only a few miles away, there was another London, a place hidden from postcards and newspapers, a district where poverty, disease, and violence were part of everyday life. That place was Whitechapel. Located in London's East End, Whitechapel had become home to thousands of immigrants, laborers, and families struggling to survive. Entire households often shared a single room. Many had no running water. Food was scarce. Work was uncertain. Every day was a battle simply to stay alive. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the streets transformed. Thick fog drifted through narrow alleyways. Gas lamps cast weak pools of yellow light onto the wet cobblestones. Most corners remained hidden in darkness. It was a place where strangers could disappear without anyone noticing. Crime was common. Pickpockets blended effortlessly into the crowds. Gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. Alcohol addiction was widespread. Violence often went unreported because many believed the police could do little to help. For countless women, survival left few choices. Many turned to prostitution, not because they wanted to, but because it was often the only way to earn enough money for a bed or a meal. Most lodging houses charged only a few pennies for a night's shelter. Those who couldn't pay were forced back onto the streets until they earned enough money. Every evening, dozens of vulnerable women wandered through Whitechapel searching for customers. Few realized that someone else was searching too. Someone who watched the streets patiently. Someone who understood every narrow alley, every shortcut, every place where darkness concealed the truth. The police had no reason to suspect that a serial killer was about to emerge. At the time, the very concept of a serial murderer was almost unknown. Murders happened, but a killer who repeatedly hunted strangers, that was something few investigators had ever imagined. Within weeks, Whitechapel would become the center of one of the greatest criminal investigations in history. Newspapers around the world would report on a mysterious murderer whose identity has never been confirmed. His crimes would inspire countless books, endless theories, and more than a century of unanswered questions. But before the world knew his name, before fear spread through every street of Whitechapel, there was one ordinary night and one woman who unknowingly became part of history. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. By the summer of 1888, life in Whitechapel had become increasingly desperate. Thousands of people struggled to survive from one day to the next. For many women, finding enough money for food or a bed was a daily challenge. Among them was a 43-year-old woman named Mary Ann Nichols. Friends and family knew her simply as Polly. Her life had not always been filled with hardship. Years earlier, she had been married and was raising a family. But over time, financial difficulties, alcoholism, and personal struggles tore her life apart. Eventually, she and her husband separated. With nowhere permanent to live, Mary drifted between workhouses, cheap lodging houses, and the streets of Whitechapel. Every night followed the same routine. If she could earn enough money before midnight, she could afford a bed in one of the local lodging houses. If she failed, she would spend another cold night wandering the streets. On the evening of August 30th, 1888, Mary left the lodging house where she had been staying after being unable to pay the small nightly fee. Witnesses later remembered seeing her walking through Whitechapel. Despite her circumstances, she appeared calm. She reportedly told friends she would soon earn enough money to return. It was a sentence that would later become tragically ironic. As midnight passed, Whitechapel grew quieter. Shops closed, the streets emptied. Only a handful of people remained outside beneath the dim glow of gas lamps. Somewhere in those narrow streets, another person was walking. Unlike Mary, he wasn't searching for work. He wasn't searching for shelter. He was searching for a victim. In the early hours of August 31st, a carman named Charles Cross was making his usual journey to work. As he walked along Buck's Row, something caught his attention. At first, he believed it was nothing more than a bundle of discarded clothing lying in the darkness. As he moved closer, he realized it was the body of a woman. Another passerby, Robert Paul, soon arrived. Together, the two men examined the scene. The woman appeared unconscious. In the poor lighting, neither man immediately realized how serious her injuries were. Believing she might still be alive, they quickly alerted a nearby police officer before continuing toward work. Minutes later, officers returned to the scene. This time, the horrifying truth became clear. Mary Ann Nichols was dead. Doctors discovered severe injuries that immediately suggested the attack had been deliberate. Investigators secured the area and began interviewing local residents. Yet almost immediately, they faced a familiar problem. No witnesses had seen the attack. No one reported hearing screams. There was no obvious suspect. Whitechapel was a maze of narrow streets and dark alleyways. A killer who knew the area could disappear within moments. At first, detectives believed they were investigating a single, brutal murder. Tragic, but isolated. They had no reason to believe that this crime would become the beginning of one of the most infamous murder investigations in history. Within days, the killer would strike again, and London would begin to realize that someone was hunting the streets of Whitechapel. At first, the murder of Mary Ann Nichols was treated as a tragic but isolated crime. Violence was not uncommon in Whitechapel. Detectives believed the killer would eventually be identified through witnesses or local informants, but only 8 days later, another body was discovered. On the morning of September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Like Mary Ann Nichols, Annie had struggled for years with poverty and homelessness. She often relied on temporary work and spent many nights searching for enough money to afford a bed. Witnesses reported seeing her alive only a short time before her death. She had been speaking with a man near the entrance to Hanbury Street. No one could later identify him. When investigators arrived, they immediately noticed disturbing similarities to the previous murder. The victim had been attacked during the early hours of the morning. The location was secluded, and the killer appeared to have escaped without leaving any reliable trace. Detectives could no longer dismiss the possibility that the same person was responsible. Newspapers quickly picked up the story. Headlines warned of a murderer roaming the streets of Whitechapel. Fear spread rapidly. Women became afraid to walk alone after sunset. Shopkeepers closed their businesses earlier. Patrols increased throughout the district. Yet despite the growing police presence, The killer remained invisible. Then came the night that historians would later call the double event. During the early hours of September 30th, 1888, 2 women were murdered within less than 1 hour. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. Her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard. Unlike the previous murders, investigators believe the killer may have been interrupted before carrying out everything he had intended. Some detectives suggested someone had approached the area unexpectedly, forcing the attacker to flee. And if that theory was true, the killer had not finished. Less than an hour later, only a short distance away, another body was found. This time, the victim was Catherine Eddowes. The discovery shocked even experienced investigators. 2 murders. One night. One city gripped by fear. Police now faced an undeniable conclusion. Whitechapel was no longer dealing with a series of unrelated crimes. A serial killer was hunting the streets, officers worked around the clock, hundreds of people were questioned, homes were searched. Local residents organized volunteer patrols, hoping to catch the murderer before he struck again. Newspapers published countless theories. Every suspicious stranger became a potential suspect. Every rumor spread like wildfire. Yet despite the enormous public attention, the killer continued to outsmart everyone. Then, on November 9th, 1888, he committed what many believe was his final and most infamous murder. The victim's name was Mary Jane Kelly, and after her death, nothing in Whitechapel would ever be the same. By October of 1888, Whitechapel was no longer simply a poor district in East London. It had become the center of international attention. Every morning, newspapers printed new theories. Every evening, fear returned to the streets. The police increased patrols. Detectives worked day and night. Yet despite the enormous investigation, the killer remained invisible. Then, the investigation took an unexpected turn. On September 27th, just days before the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the Central News Agency received a handwritten letter. It appeared to come from the murderer himself. The writer mocked the police. He claimed they would never catch him. He even joked about clipping the ears from one of his future victims. At the bottom of the letter, the author signed with a name the world had never seen before: Jack the Ripper. At first, many investigators believed the letter was a hoax. Newspapers received hundreds of false confessions during the investigation. Some were written by people seeking attention. Others were cruel jokes. Yet this letter was different. The name was unforgettable. Within days, every newspaper in Britain was using it. Soon, the rest of the world followed. The unidentified killer no longer remained anonymous. He had become Jack the Ripper. Then on October 1st, another postcard arrived. It became known as the Saucy Jackie postcard. The writer appeared to reference the 2 murders committed during what newspapers had begun calling the double event. Once again, police struggled to determine whether the message had truly come from the killer. Public fascination only continued to grow. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices waiting for the latest updates. Every rumor became front-page news. Every stranger was viewed with suspicion. The pressure on Scotland Yard became immense. Officers interviewed butchers, doctors, sailors, immigrants, even members of London's upper class. Thousands of names were recorded. Hundreds of people were questioned. Yet every promising lead eventually disappeared. Then, in mid-October, another letter arrived. Unlike the previous messages,
This one contained something deeply disturbing. It became known as the From Hell letter. The package reportedly included part of a human kidney. The anonymous writer claimed it belonged to one of the victims. Whether the claim was genuine has never been proven. Even today, historians continue to debate whether the letter truly came from the killer, but by then, the damage had already been done. Jack the Ripper had become more than a murderer. He had become a legend. Newspapers fueled public fear. Stories spread across Europe, then across the Atlantic, transforming an unknown criminal into one of history's most infamous names. Yet despite all the headlines, all the letters, and the largest investigation Victorian London had ever seen, the identity of Jack the Ripper remained a mystery. And while detectives desperately searched for the man behind the letters, and the largest investigation Victorian London had ever seen, the identity of Jack the Ripper remained a mystery. And while detectives desperately searched for the man behind the letters, the investigation was about to enter its most frustrating chapter. A chapter filled with suspects, endless theories, and questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. Following the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the streets of Whitechapel grew quieter. Weeks passed, then months. The terrifying series of murders appeared to have come to an abrupt end. For the first time in weeks, London could breathe again, but relief did not bring answers. Jack the Ripper had vanished. Scotland Yard now faced an entirely different challenge: finding a killer who no longer seemed to be killing. The investigation became one of the largest criminal inquiries Victorian Britain had ever seen. Detectives collected thousands of witness statements. More than 2,000 people were interviewed. Hundreds were questioned in detail. Dozens were considered serious suspects. Yet every promising lead eventually collapsed. Some witnesses described a well-dressed gentleman. Others remembered a poorly dressed laborer. Some believed the killer was a local resident. Others insisted he was a foreign sailor who disappeared after the murders. Every description contradicted another. It was as if the killer had left behind dozens of different identities, but not a single real face. As the years passed, several names emerged as the most likely suspects. One of them was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born barber who lived in Whitechapel during the murders. According to later police memoranda, some investigators believed he closely matched the profile of the killer. Decades later, his name would once again make headlines after claims that modern DNA testing linked him to one of the victims. But the evidence remains heavily disputed. Other experts argue that the DNA was incomplete, contaminated, or simply incapable of identifying a single individual with certainty. Another frequently discussed suspect was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher whose death shortly after the murders fueled speculation for generations. Some investigators believed his disappearance was more than a coincidence. Others found almost no evidence connecting him to the crimes. Then there was George Chapman, a man later convicted of multiple murders. His violent history made him an appealing suspect. Yet once again, the timeline and available evidence failed to prove he was Jack the Ripper. Over the decades, more than 100 different people have been accused: doctors, butchers, sailors, artists, members of the British aristocracy. Even members of the royal family became the subject of conspiracy theories. Some of these theories captured public imagination. Others collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny.
but none provided the one thing investigators had always needed: proof. More than 130 years later, historians continue to debate the identity of Jack the Ripper. Advances in forensic science have reopened the case countless times. DNA analysis, digital crime reconstruction, historical research. Every generation has believed it might finally solve the mystery, yet every new claim has been met with the same problem. There is simply not enough unquestionable evidence to reach a definitive conclusion. Officially, Jack the Ripper has never been identified. His crimes changed policing forever. They transformed the relationship between newspapers and criminal investigations. They inspired countless books, films, television series, and decades of research. More than a century has passed. The streets of Whitechapel have changed. The gas lamps are gone. The alleyways look different. Nearly everyone connected to the investigation has long since disappeared into history. But one question remains: who was Jack the Ripper? And perhaps we will never know. When the Whitechapel murders finally came to an end, many believed the mystery would eventually be solved. Detectives were confident that sooner or later, someone would make a mistake. A witness would come forward. A confession would emerge, or new evidence would expose the killer's identity. None of that ever happened. Instead, the mystery only grew. As years turned into decades, Jack the Ripper became more than an unsolved criminal case. He became one of history's greatest legends. Newspapers continued publishing new theories. Authors devoted entire books to the investigation. Historians searched forgotten police archives. Amateur detectives spent years studying every witness statement, every map, and every surviving document. Entire careers have been built around one simple question: who was Jack the Ripper? The fascination spread far beyond Britain. Around the world, the case inspired countless documentaries, novels, television series, films, podcasts, and academic studies. Every generation believed it might finally uncover the truth. Every generation produced another theory. Some claimed the killer was a doctor. Others insisted he was a butcher. Some argued he possessed advanced anatomical knowledge. Others believed the murders required no medical training at all. There were even theories suggesting Jack the Ripper never existed as a single individual. According to some researchers, multiple unrelated killers may have committed the crimes later attributed to one mysterious figure. Others believe the legend itself became larger than the evidence. Over time, fact and fiction began to blend together. Every new book introduced another suspect. Every documentary presented another possibility. Yet one problem remained unchanged. The original investigation took place in 1888. Crime scene preservation was primitive. Fingerprint analysis had not yet become standard practice. DNA testing was unimaginable. Surveillance cameras did not exist. Modern forensic science simply wasn't available. Much of the physical evidence disappeared long ago. Important documents were lost. Witnesses died. Memories faded. What remains today are fragments, police reports, newspaper articles, personal letters, and unanswered questions. Despite more than a century of research, no theory has convinced every expert. No suspect has been universally accepted. No piece of evidence has ended the debate. Perhaps that is why the story refuses to disappear. Jack the Ripper represents something deeper than an unsolved murder case. He represents humanity's endless desire to solve the impossible, to find answers where none seem to exist, to believe that every mystery can eventually be explained. But some mysteries
continue to challenge us, even after more than 130 years. Whether the truth still lies hidden inside forgotten archives, or disappeared forever with the killer himself, no one can say for certain. One thing, however, remains undeniable. Jack the Ripper changed criminal history forever, and his shadow still lingers over the streets of Whitechapel. More than a century has passed since the streets of Whitechapel were haunted by an unknown killer. The world has changed beyond recognition. Fingerprint databases now contain millions of records. DNA technology can identify suspects decades after crimes were committed. Artificial intelligence assists investigators in analyzing enormous amounts of evidence. Modern forensic science has solved countless cold cases once believed impossible. Naturally, many people have wondered whether these same techniques could finally reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper. Over the years, researchers have repeatedly returned to the surviving evidence. Old police files have been digitized. Forgotten witness statements have been re-examined. Historians have reconstructed the streets of Victorian Whitechapel using maps, photographs, and official records. Every generation has approached the mystery with new tools. Every generation has believed it might succeed where the previous one failed. In recent years, several researchers have claimed that modern DNA analysis has finally identified the killer. The name most often mentioned is Aaron Kosminski. According to these claims, biological material recovered from a shawl allegedly linked to one of the victims pointed toward Kosminski's family line. Newspapers around the world quickly reported that the mystery had finally been solved. But the announcement was immediately met with skepticism. Many forensic experts questioned whether the shawl could even be reliably connected to the original crime scene. Others argued that the evidence had likely been contaminated over the decades. Some pointed out that the DNA sample itself was far too limited to identify a single individual with certainty. In other words, the scientific community remained divided. Once again, a promising lead had produced more questions than answers. Historians continue to disagree over almost every major detail of the case. Which murders truly belonged to Jack the Ripper? Which letters were genuine? Did the killer possess medical knowledge? Or was that assumption based on exaggerated newspaper reports? Was he a local resident? Or someone who disappeared from London forever? Every answer seems to create another mystery. Perhaps that is why this case continues to fascinate people around the world. Unlike most famous crimes, there is no final chapter, no courtroom, no confession, no undeniable proof, only theories, possibilities, and questions that refuse to disappear, somewhere within forgotten archives, hidden inside faded documents, or perhaps already lost forever. The truth may still exist, but until undeniable evidence is discovered, Jack the Ripper will remain exactly what he has always been, one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. More than 130 years have passed since the final Whitechapel murder. The narrow streets where fear once ruled have changed beyond recognition. Modern apartment buildings now stand where crowded lodging houses once struggled to survive. Electric lights have replaced the dim glow of Victorian gas lamps. The horse-drawn carriages are gone. The markets are quieter. Yet despite the passing of time, one shadow has never truly disappeared. The name Jack the Ripper continues to echo through history. His crimes transform criminal investigations forever. They expose the limitations of Victorian policing. They forced detectives to rethink how serial crimes were investigated. They demonstrated the enormous influence newspapers could have over public opinion. For perhaps the first time in modern history, A murderer became an international headline. Every new development was printed across Britain. Soon, across Europe. Then, across the world. Long before television, long before the internet. Jack the Ripper became one of history's first global criminal mysteries. His story inspired generations of investigators, writers, historians, journalists, psychologists, and ordinary people fascinated by unanswered questions. Thousands of books have been written. Hundreds of documentaries have been produced. Countless hours have been spent examining maps, comparing witness statements, analyzing old police reports, searching for one detail that everyone else may have missed. Yet despite all of that effort, the central question remains exactly as it was in 1888. Who was Jack the Ripper? Was he an ordinary man hiding in plain sight? A respected member of society? Someone who escaped London forever? Or someone whose name appeared in police records but was never properly investigated? We may never know. Some mysteries survive because evidence is destroyed. Others survive because the truth becomes impossible to separate from myth. The story of Jack the Ripper contains both. Facts became legends, rumors became history. The unknown became unforgettable. Even today. Visitors travel from around the world to walk the streets of Whitechapel. Guided tours retrace the final footsteps of the victims. Museums preserve the surviving evidence. Researchers continue to publish new theories. And every few years, headlines once again claim that the mystery has finally been solved. But those headlines always lead back to the same conclusion. There is no undeniable proof. Perhaps there never will be. And maybe that is exactly why the story refuses to fade. Because Jack the Ripper is no longer remembered simply as a killer. He's become a symbol of every mystery that history has failed to answer. A reminder that even in an age of science, technology, and endless information, some questions remain beyond our reach, and perhaps they always will. Maybe one day, someone will finally solve this mystery. But until then, don't count sheep, count mysteries.